Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar. We will be starting in about 5 minutes just to let everybody in. Shouldn't be too long. Okay, so if Keith and Christian, you're ready, we will be starting. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to our webinar from Léger and LG2. We have Christian Bourque and Keith Barry here who will be presenting the commercial shift. Just so everybody knows, you are on mute. If you want to ask questions, we will wait until the end. You have a panel to your right where you can ask questions. So I will be, as your host, I'm Jessica. I will be hosting you. If you have questions, we'll just put it in the panel. So Christian, Keith, there you go.
All right. Thank you, Jessica. Hi, I'm Christian from Leger. I basically manage our Montreal office, and I've been working on this research now for the past 3 months with LG2. I'll let Keith introduce himself as well.
So I'm Keith Berry. I'm the Vice President of Strategy at LG2 in Toronto. I'm also a partner there, and we've been working obviously together with Leger on a number of different projects, but this has been a big focus for us for a little while, and we're very excited to share some insights with you today.
Perfect. The reason why both our companies came together in this project is basically because we're looking at this pandemic and the impact it's having on consumers, but we're coming at it from two different sort of angles or lenses, and we felt that by putting these lenses together, we would be able to provide better insights to our clients, and that's why we believe anyway that this would be sort of a great endeavor to work on this together. I don't know from your perspective, Keith.
Yeah, I think it's constantly, for us, data is at the center of everything that we do. However, we want to make sure that we're also putting an overlay of empathy on that to understand what do we do with that, how do we take those raw data points and turn it into something meaningful for consumers vis-a-vis our clients and brands that we work with.
Absolutely. Very quick overview of the methodology. This is wave 3 of our study that we started in early April when we were just into this sort of self-isolation, early pandemic mode. We then went back to the data in late April, early May, when we were in the middle of the crisis. And our third wave now, which basically we collected the data between June 15th and June 24th, is basically when we were starting to go back to some form of not normal, but some form of increased freedom when it comes to how we act as citizens and as consumers. And that's when we wanted to capture the data again. Now, today we won't be able to give you all of the answers to all of the questions in the study because we'd be here all afternoon. But basically, we measured 61 different behaviors and habits, consumer habits, whether they're online, they're in-store behaviors that have changed. It might be towards a service provider, for example, online banking is part of the study as well. But we also measured 61 attitudes about their home, about how they socialize, about how they feel about their finances, and so on and so forth, to see basically how they were reacting in terms of behavioral changes, but also how they were actually adapting from a more the perspective of how their actual perceptions of the world were changing throughout this crisis. So we'll be providing you with some key highlights in the data, but there's a lot more depth in the actual detailed report itself.
So this is an interesting one where, obviously there's no surprise that the pandemic has made changes or created changes for almost everyone. 91% of respondents said that they've changed as a result of the pandemic in some way, shape, or form. So this could, have an effect on their purchase decisions, what they decide to buy and where, whether that's, brick and mortar or online. A lot of people moving online for the first time, changing priorities. As one has to, can't travel necessarily abroad, do you take that money, do you invest it, do you improve your home because you're spending more time there? And I think one of the main ones that's kind of an overlay across everything is how people's emotions have been affected as a result of the pandemic, and the kinds of new anxieties that have sprung up and have probably, we've seen sort of peaks and valleys, so we'll explore that a little bit. And then, there are a number of different ways that we could have presented the information today around, we could look at how it's changed segmentation as an example. But what we wanted to do was look at, there are 6 key themes that we wanted to talk to that pretty much apply to everyone. And the practice leads at LG2 have provided their point of view to guide each one. So we'll take you through that with some great examples. So the first is health and safety. And one is the impact lifestyle and living spaces. Oh, we're going down. It's digital switchover, redefining the pace of life and living spaces, financial awareness, responsible consumption, and increased autonomy and creativity.
Perfect. So basically, we'll take you through all 6. I'll start with some data points that we gathered from the data, and I'll let Keith sort of provide examples of how brands have adapted to this new reality and how they're making the best of this unfortunate circumstance that we all know as the COVID pandemic. First, health and safety. This is data taken from our weekly study that we also publish, and it's showing sort of a curve that is, in many ways, retailers out there and brands should take into consideration. At the peak of the crisis, 64% of Canadians said, "I'm afraid of catching this virus." Then slowly that fear was trending downwards as we were moving across time. But over the past 3 weeks, here it comes back up again. 3/4 of Canadians believe that there will be a wave 2 of this pandemic. We're measuring over the weekend now the percentage of Canadians who believe we will go back to the measures that were in place in March and April. Do they fear that we will go back into a form of lockdown that we now know as the reality from last spring? And so the new habits and the new way of looking at things that Canadians have adopted over the past 3 months are sticking around, because we're seeing this thing is not going away, and how it's affecting us as citizens and as consumers is not going away. So what we're presenting today is sort of how people have changed over time, but this change is significant from the perspective that this will last. When looking at health and safety, of course, we all expected this. The purchase of disinfectant and surface disinfectants has gone steadily up from wave 1 to wave 3. Our houses have never been cleaner than they are right now. And it also tells us a little bit about how we've evolved as consumers. But it also tells us what our expectations are when we actually go to a restaurant or back to a restaurant and back to a retail store. We expect that these places will be cleaner than surgical instruments in a hospital. These are our new expectations of how we want our world, to a certain extent, sanitized. And it has changed us, not only in terms of what we buy, but how we see the world around us. What we also see is that retailers have had to adapt to this new reality. And we ask people, the measures that were put in place where you shop, are they an incentive to go there, or are they detrimental to you wanting to actually go to this place? What we find is that more people say that, yes, it is an incentive to shop there. If I feel that the measures they've adopted are in line with what I feel is safest, it's an incentive to shop. However, at the other end of the spectrum, some people are not having all that much fun in these new circumstances. And what I think is striking is the generational gap. One example, if we look at it by region, where these measures were most severe was in Quebec, and we see that there, the relationship with these measures is a bit more negative. But if you look by generation, way at the right of the graph, we're seeing that it's only the 55 plus who tend to be extremely positive about the changes that are put in place. We now expect where we go to be a safe place. However, maybe there's a lack of people making it fun for us because whether it's Gen Z, millennials, or even part of Gen X is certainly feeling that this is not a fun time to shop. We asked people, of the measures that were put in place, which one do you think should become permanent? And which ones do you think will not? That in some way, shape, or form, over the short to medium term, they'll be gone. 71% of people feel that having hand sanitizer when you enter a store is something that will become permanent. That they will disinfect your shopping cart is something they expect will be permanent. That you wash your hands when you come into a store will become permanent. Half of the people believe that these new plexiglass that we see between us and the clerk, or us and the person on the other side of the desk, half of the people believe that this will become and should become permanent. Now, if you look at that sort of these items on the left, if you are redesigning your stores, if you are in any way, shape, or form trying to rethink how people actually walk through your store and how they engage with your employees, you need to consider that some of the changes that you are making now will become to some extent permanent. So might as well do it the right way the first time around. Now, some measures are in people's minds temporary and will likely go away. But however, the way your stores have changed and that we quickly adapted to this change very early on some of these changes will be part of the landscape of your store for a long while.
So this is a quote here from Alain Fortin, who is a partner at LG2 and leads the architecture discipline at LG2. We have 3 architects on staff. And it's interesting because in the last webinar we hosted, we talked about how behaviors that resulted from the pandemic may not be permanent, but expectations would be. And I think health and safety is one where many of those expectations will remain permanent, as we've just gone through. It was actually really funny. I saw a meme on Instagram last week that was talking about how once it was perfectly normal to have a birthday and have someone blow up birthday candles all over the cake that everyone else in the room was about to eat. And so it was kind of funny because it was reinforced the notion that things that were once will probably never be normal again. And so, you know, with health and safety, there's a lot to be learned. But Helen's perspective is that instead of seeing health and safety precautions as a detriment to the brand experience, think about it as a way to help build brand. So what are those opportunities where you could find ways to do that differently or to express values that are core to the brand that help differentiate, as opposed to looking at it as only a negative? If you even think about a number of years ago, Virgin Atlantic, you know, the safety precaution videos that run on every airline and are heavily regulated and frankly, you know, pretty dull. They turned around and used that as a moment of entertainment and created a whole bunch of dancing movement things that were perfectly reasonable to come from a brand like Virgin and exactly what you'd expect. And so they took something that was probably a low point or an irritant in that experience and turned it into something that would build a lasting impression for consumers. So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about here. So we'll look at some examples. Elix is a maker of customized and personalized craft beer cans, typically for special events. And now they've made it available so that you could actually use the space, and they've partnered with freelance designers and helped to support them through COVID, knowing that they're likely having challenges with work. And so you can basically create different products, and there's a fund that they put toward that. So again, in the era where health and safety is still important, and you know, you can think about all the different ways that you could use these outdoors at events and things like that, they're finding new ways to connect and new ways to create a personality around a brand. Philips, the electronics manufacturer, is now working to create a tailored display solution for retailers. And it's basically a queue management system. So what it does is it not only uses screens as you would expect or come to see in many retail locations, but also with people counting technology, which not only can make sure that the right number of people are in the right parts of the store, can also connect with automatic door systems to actually maintain traffic. So it's currently being trialed across countries in Europe, but one that we're very likely to see in North America, I would imagine, if that goes well. And at the same time, you can use these screens as you would today to display promotional or informational messages to take any kind of promotions or information needs to be portrayed in the store. And then the last one is kind of a funny one. KFC, you know, I think a lot of quick serve restaurants have been hit through the pandemic, depending on whether they have delivery or not. KFC is a brand that has few to almost no drive-through experiences. So they've probably been hit a little bit harder because people have to go into the store directly to pick up or do curbside. So this is something that they're testing right now, is use of robotics to automate the fulfillment of orders. And so again, even if this is something that doesn't become widespread, it's something that sort of signals their intention and actually could be something that you message in a very sort of fun and interesting way.
All right. The second one, and Keith alluded to earlier, is the this springboard to digital that has been this pandemic. We showed this graph the last time around, about a month ago but even still today, we see that as we're moving through the crisis, even though the rate or the pace of change is somewhat slowing down, 65% of Canadians, 2/3 of us, have actually engaged in something for the first time online, or have been doing it much more significantly than before the crisis. That includes half of Canadians who've done something online, transactional, online for the very first time in their lives. Now, once you actually factor in two things, and the reason why some of these behaviors will last is the fact that on average, 80% of Canadians say they're satisfied with these different sort of new ways of engaging with brands, and 82% say, and thus I will continue doing it after this crisis. I mean, there's a strong belief that these new ways of doing things are actually fun and are actually effective from a consumer perspective. When you actually look at that pace of change, we look at here at people who are doing things for the first time. Early in the crisis, I mean, the transformation was not that quick. Over the first month of the crisis, only 18% of people had done something for the very first time online during the crisis. Then it jumped mid-crisis to 48, and we're now at 50. So we're slowly finding sort of a peak in terms of where we are in terms of digital switchover. However, when you're talking about 50% of people, you're not talking only about sort of late millennials jumping into the, you're not talking from a generational perspective or a urban versus rural perspective. When half of people are doing something, it means that pretty much every segment of the population is doing this new form of interacting with brands online. And these are bound to stay for several reasons. One is high customer satisfaction. The other as well is still a lot of people are not going back to stores, are not comfortable about going back to the shopping mall. We measured a couple of weeks ago, 47% of Canadians say they're not ready to go back to a restaurant. So even though the restaurants are half empty because of social distancing measures, only half of us want to go. So, you know, this change towards digital from a retail and from but any sort of we want to engage in will become somewhat permanent in that our level of comfort with going back to the way things were is not there yet. You look at some of them, and you have, if you look at wave 3, the percentage of the people who've done this for the very first time. If you add groceries, whether it's in-store pickup or home delivery, you're talking about 1 in 5 Canadians who for the very first time have ordered groceries online, regardless of their mode of pickup or delivery. You look at the same for prescriptions at the pharmacy. 10% have done this for the very first time. Renovation centers and hardware stores, who would have thought you would be able to buy your tomato plants online and pick them up at the store? Nobody had done that in the past. Coffee and tea that you actually order online and get delivered to your home. All of these categories that you see here, the percentages might seem for some of them to be fairly low, but in any market, if 5% of the market suddenly disappeared or suddenly switched over to somebody else, we'd call it a revolution. So in a way, this is a revolution. Talking to our buddies at Nielsen, prior to the crisis, 2% of all foods purchased in Canada were purchased online. If we are now, according to their estimates, close to 20%, I mean, this is a major revolution in terms of how we do things.
And so to that end, our head of technology and digital experience, LP, has an interesting point here when it comes to digital switchover, is that it's no longer a nice to have or an option, it's an imperative. And so, you know, this will cause significant challenges for businesses that have delayed the appropriate planning and investment it takes to meet current customer needs, knowing that it can take years to build the appropriate tech infrastructure at times. And of course, the interconnection between bricks and mortar and online will be even more important moving forward, because honestly, no one knows what's next. You know, we talked about the second wave. That's with this current pandemic, but you know, there is also theory that we can expect pandemics to become more frequent, which is a horrifying thought. But at the same time, this flexibility is required to meet the needs of what we know to come and what we don't know to come. So some examples here that we wanted to share. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Allbirds. They're a sustainable direct-to-consumer shoe brand. And when COVID-19 disrupted online traffic and activities, Allbirds was able to use staff from brick and mortar stores to help fulfill online orders, knowing that there was a demand there. So the swift offline to online pivot happened because the brand's e-commerce and physical stores already had a unified inventory and logistics setup and operation. So as a result, the brand was able to successfully meet consumer demand because it was already built into their systems. The interesting thing too is the brand also launched a feature that enables shoppers to connect with store associates via video chat, so they could ask questions and see product displays as though the physical store was still open. So pretty smart. Microsoft, not a huge retail footprint. However, with the closure of their stores, the company from sort of a goodwill perspective was actually able to retrain and redistribute their retail employees into new roles. So in support and training or in education across the company. And so they created a new pipeline of talent with transferable skills. So you can see how even the way that employees are being treated, how companies are sort of managing their workforce has been affected by this transfer to digital as well. On the next page, two other examples. So Genie is a Montreal-based company, and it's a all-in-one personal assistant app. And so this is just an interesting case we wanted to bring forward of people being able to chat via Facebook or Instagram on their site as though they're talking to a friend. And so you can get all of these sorts of things done when it's maybe a little bit trickier sometimes, or you have to do things a little bit differently to get some help with those things. And this was similar to the case that we had shared last time in the last webinar through Zappos, the shoe company. Their customer service, they created a whole new notion of customer service for everything you need, which allowed people to not just get customer service related to their products, but they actually leveraged their existing customer service platform to help people get food delivered or help buy a product or book something, so they could really do anything, and Genie does something similar. ASOS is another one that was interesting, where knowing that people weren't going into stores to be able to try and clothes, or maybe ordering clothes online for the first time. And so what it does is it allows you to select criteria around your body size and shape, and then the virtual or the augmented reality tool allows the clothes to sort of fit more accurately to the body type that you've defined, so you can kind of see a more realistic account of how that garment would fall on your body and how it would fit, to sort of as best as possible mirror what that experience would look like in the store. And obviously, not only to attract people, but also to sort of help their profit margins in terms of reducing the number of returns, because hopefully people would see product that they like and more accurately reflected what it would look like.
Actually, this example of ASOS is interesting, because when we measure people doing or buying apparel for the first time, these people give this sort of transaction the lowest level of satisfaction of the 61 we measure. So there are issues with buying apparel online for those who are doing it for the very first time. Some of us that are used to it like it, but for first timers, there are several obstacles to delivering a good, positive customer experience.
This is to assume that this is done perfectly well and that it's understood and that the user experience itself is good. So the intention of wanting to do this and the execution, of course, is a whole other matter.
Yeah, absolutely. Pace of life and living spaces is, I think, a major change that we're seeing through this pandemic. And I don't think we can yet measure the extent to which it will redefine our economy. Of course, one thing that jumps at us is the amount of people working from home or doing it or telecommuting for the first time, or significantly more than what they used to. So 41% of Canadians experience working from home for the first time, or increase that frequency in an important fashion during the crisis. 44% of people say they are very satisfied with working from home. I mean, very. So if you are that person's employer, good luck. And if you add those who are somewhat satisfied with their experience, you're up to 80% of those who are actually working from home saying that they are satisfied with this arrangement. And 80% of Canadians or that working from home want to continue working from home in the future. So the pressure on employers will be immense. The impact on retail will be important as we, slowly go back to the office once in a while. What's the impact on that food court at the basement of your high-rise office building? I mean, all of these things will be important. If you are a store, do you actually develop your footprint to be closer to where people live or closer to where people work? I mean, that equation has been changed by this pandemic. Some other elements too about working from home and being more at home. 80% are more concerned about their comfort and well-being at home. Again, if you are into home renovations, this is a key variable that you need to take in. I mean, you'll be in high demand if you are actually are a home renovator. 69% place more important on taking care of themselves. We even saw that any product that's tied to pampering yourself is actually products that are actually selling more now than before the pandemic. 42% of people feel like furnishing or decorating their home differently. So they will make changes to their living spaces because they're living there a whole lot more than they used to. 42% have adopted new hobbies. Again, this is tons of opportunities for brands out there. 40% spend more time having fun in general than before. So this whole idea that they're actually getting some control back over that key variable, which is time, is something that can be seen as an opportunity as well. And 35% are planning home renovations that they weren't planning before the crisis. Again, some people will actually find that their summer is extremely busy as people are making plans to renovate the inside, but also the outside of their homes, because a lot of us will be vacationing in our backyard.
And so, beyond the realities of social distancing that the pandemic has made clear that, prior to the pandemic, I'm sure a lot of people would have thought that it would be impossible to work from home exclusively. However, with the right tools and processes and sort of methodologies, it's become clear that it's quite possible. And so, to Christian's point, it's caused us to all kind of re-examine what we want from our daily life. When do we need to go to the office versus when can we stay home? What are those activities? What are the implications on things like the commute? LG2 has been working through our own plan in terms of what we do with our office space. And one of the big questions that came up was not whether people wanted to be in the office or not, which, we're putting out surveys and doing all that sort of stuff to understand, but also the difference between those people who have a car to commute versus those who have to, get on the TTC to get to work. And that sort of immediately changes the perspective of whether people want to make the trek into work or not, just from a safety perspective or perceived safety perspective, more than anything else. And it starts to question, okay, well, what does this mean from the employer in terms of the expectations they will have on their employees and how they can be as flexible as possible to not only make sure that ways of working can continue, but also how do they become an employee that people want to work for? And what is the most attractive way to attract that talent? So an example on the next page is Gensler, which is an international architecture firm. And they've actually developed a whole series of digital tools to help company adapt their office spaces. So there's one called Rerun, and it's a data-driven process in a post-COVID workplace sort of world to help businesses plan their occupancy planning. And so using the existing layout of the office, this Rerun tool can quickly generate a whole bunch of different scenarios and identify the most optimized plan for a variety of different physical distancing conditions, whether they're organizing 100 or 1,000 of seats. And then there's another complementary tool called Wisp that helps clients visualize and communicate to their teams which seats in the office are available for occupancy at, whether that's at a floor, a neighborhood, or a departmental level, in order to streamline that process. And one that we've seen, we've pulled up Twitter as an example here, but there are no shortage of companies in Silicon Valley and beyond that have already announced that they expect work from home to become a permanent fixture, and there are no set dates for people to be expected to return to work. I know even Shopify in Canada has made a similar announcement, even after they've spent what I would assume are millions and millions of dollars of securing office space, in Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto. So a big shift there just in terms of the intention of what work will look like, and also easing up the expectation that you have to come to work in order to be productive. So an interesting notion to keep in mind.
Our finances. In a lot of ways, this pandemic has changed how our relationship to money, and on a number of levels. 26% of us say that they will definitely reduce their spending on what they consider to be non-essential spending. Another half of us say at least try to cut back on non-essential spending. So a lot of Canadians out there right now are deciding for themselves what is essential. And I think a lot of brands, and in my perspective, because we saw it as the outcome of 2008, 2009 in our last economic setback back then, is that it tended to squeeze out the middle. Those who have sort of a barely differentiated product offering that offer the average product at the average price for the average consumer, they're the ones who very often become non-essential. Whereas you'll find that there'll be a lot of competition at the discount end of the spectrum, yet at the same time there'll be very stiff competition at the high-end experiential, high value add end of the spectrum as well. But if you get stuck in the middle, this is where you can be sort of in that no man's land of not being essential anymore. And you really need to reconsider what your brand proposition is out there to make sure that you sort of redefine that relationship to your customer and be in that sort of on the right side of the equation, on the essential side, when they actually tick the list off. Beyond that too, compared to before the crisis, 77% of us want to reduce our debt load to be less at risk. For the very first time, there's a couple of generations of consumers who were put at risk for the very first time in their lives. I mean, that's a new notion that we did not expect before when we were, I mean, there was barely any unemployment going into this crisis. There was always a better job at a better salary somewhere if you were keen on looking for it. We're not in that situation anymore. So we are actually reassessing our relationship to debt as we move out of it. 57% say they're more worried about their finances now. 52% of Canadian households suffered a setback in terms of their household income during this crisis, and it shows here. 52% incurred financial losses we just talked about, but that 52% is actually very interesting. In Europe now, the data that's out right now is showing that on the whole, Europe has saved more money compared to the year before. That some of us, because our lives have changed and the way we actually sort of commute, where we eat, what we buy has actually been modified by this crisis. A lot of us have been able to save a little bit more money than we were able to do the same time last year. 52% say they want to actually reconsider their retirement savings strategy as well. Half of us are managing our money differently since the crisis has started. So you see constantly that one out of every two Canadians, at least one out of every two Canadians, actually wants to change the relationship they have with money. What will this mean? In one end of the spectrum, our tourism dollar that we may not be spending becomes available income to do something else. But at the same time, are we slowly considering pulling money out of the short-term economy and into our savings to inject that money into our retirement savings strategy? A lot of this is sort of pretty much up in the air, but really we need to reconsider how we actually handle our money because this crisis has hurt us, or many of us, and we feel we could suffer from a setback like this in the future as well.
And so Anne-Marie Leclerc, who leads our innovation practice, brings up a really good point here. So in a world where we're re-examining how we spend our money, of course, price will remain, a key factor in terms of affordability. But, as Christian mentioned, in the world of averages, price is not going to be that thing that stands out. In fact, other measures will rise up to take its place. So things like relevance, goodwill, and durability. Factors that make people feel like they're making good choices and reflect the emotional needs that they have, that the pandemic has forced to surface. So it's not to say that these needs didn't exist before, but I think the idea that you have to choose what's expected or choose what you've done before is kind of going away. And I think businesses are realizing that, and brands have to change how they connect with those more emotional needs, knowing that people are less likely to remain loyal if those needs aren't met or reflected. So on the next page, we have two examples in the financial sector specifically. So TD actually created a web experience where they put forward different measures and resources in place for customers. I'm sure you're all familiar with sort of the mortgage deferrals and things like that. But they did it, just do it, as a click a button here and then, phone a number or we'll get in touch with you. But they wanted to create more of a clear and empathetic way to guide people through that process. So there's an offer on their site where there's a step-by-step experience asking users about their situation, their needs, and their concerns to really understand how they were affected by COVID in order to match them with the right advisor who can then work with them to find suitable solutions that meet their needs. American Express also pivoted their reward program for obvious reasons, but again, pretty impressive that they're able to do it so quickly. So the reward system that was typically centered around travel perks now makes it easier for customers to move those points over to grocery, food delivery, and online entertainment, knowing that people are not only unable to, but unwilling to travel during this time. So two pretty good examples.
Sure. Another area of change, and we alluded to that in the last webinar as well, is in a way buying should make sense, and bringing some form of social responsibility into what we buy, where we buy, and when we buy things. And of course, we saw the big push for buying local throughout this crisis. 21% of Canadians say they've increased their spending on local products. 65% want to eat more locally produced foods. 63% buy more products that are made here compared to before. So a high willingness and a lot of some of those small decisions that we've made throughout this crisis to buy Canadian more often are actually showing up in the data. It's not having yet this sort of major impact on what we actually put in our grocery basket, because there's several obstacles to buying more local products. I mean, it's still a battle for local producers and local stores to make that happen. However, the door is wide open. So it's left to us as producers and as merchants to find a way to tap into this willingness to buy local more often that we're actually seeing in the data. But beyond buying local, 42% of us say they would like to get more involved in doing volunteer work as a result of the crisis. 28% of us say we are now more involved in our community compared to before the crisis. I mean, this is all great, of course, that we individually want to make those decisions. But what also happens, and typically what happens, is that consumers who feel this way about what should be their involvement in the community will transfer into what they expect of brands out there. So what are you doing to show a greater involvement in your community and making sense of why I should spend my money with you as a brand?
And so, we've all known for some time of the importance and the integration of how companies make decisions and how that affects us, and of course how we as consumers can have an effect on the world based on the things that we buy. But I think now it's become even more real, more apparent, and more important to a larger number of consumers. So people before that would say, yes, it's important for me to be more environmentally friendly, or yes, it's important that a company shares my values. I think there's a whole group now that beyond just saying it are acting upon it. And this becomes even, on top of the pandemic, of course, in the political climate that we see, particularly in the South, where, buying a can of Goya beans is a gesture about or against your political beliefs. There is an opportunity for creativity even to help brands, align their values with their consumers more overtly, ideally without pandering, of course, but it's definitely an interesting time in terms of aligning with the values of brands and consumers. So one of the examples that I alluded to last time, but we didn't show, was a buy local campaign that we did actually at LG2 that prompted different local, in this case, provincially local Quebec-based brands to come together. And what was really interesting was to see the openness to support other businesses, sometimes competitors, in terms of referring people to other local brands and making it as easy as possible to unite that movement. And it gained incredible traction instantly, particularly I think because it captured the notion of passion and connection that Quebecers have to La Belle Provence. So I think it was very well received and really interesting in that very quickly people were able to come together to support local. Braithwaite is an interesting example of sort of this notion of radical transparency in that, beyond the price, they actually open up how their product is produced and what it costs, which was really interesting in terms of if they showcase how they make their product and where your money is going. You can imagine that it's a good way to give consumers a sense of what their brand promises, how they're working to get you a high quality product without all the middlemen. So a really interesting way to sort of open up that chain that is normally hidden. And then the last one is an example of a service-based mobile application that promotes local purchase by helping customers find local merchants and products near them. So again, I don't know exactly how they're commercialized, but this notion of that if you are going to look for anything, you can look local first, as opposed to finding a product and then wondering if it's local or if there's a way to do it. So you can see how that's slowly flipping over in terms of how consumers are shopping.
Yeah, absolutely. Voting with your wallet, the expression existed before the pandemic. We just switched gears.
Yeah, it's never been more true.
Yep. Increased autonomy and creativity is something that we believe as well is an area of significant change, and one that is also that shows a lot of opportunity. 21% of us now say I'm doing my own beauty products, which treatments that I used to get from whatever place they were getting these treatments from. 18% are doing more online banking and new forms of online banking transactions now that we're in this crisis. 15% say they're doing more renovation work themselves. So this whole DIY is actually pretty much out there. We're buying seeds more than the plant now. The whole thing about doing it yourself from scratch is something that's new. Even 1 out of 10 of us are actually sort of made changes or subscribed to a telecom service plan during this pandemic on our own, on the website of that supplier, instead of just picking up the phone like we used to. When we also look at new ways of doing things, a third of Canadians actually had an online medical consultation during this crisis. Level of satisfaction is not that high, but this number is still staggering. 1 in 10 Canadians have taken an online course, which they had never done before. So again, a new channel through which you can actually do e-learning that could be an opportunity for many brands. And all of these are there showing you that people are doing new things online that are not just basically buying stuff, but are actually engaging with brands in a very significant, meaningful way. And they're doing it on their own, on their computers. And again, the whole do-it-yourself trend is something that presents a challenge for some, but also, in a lot of ways, opportunities.
Yeah, so if there is ever a time for AI to thrive, it's now, specifically as people are looking for new ways to do things and maybe going around traditional paths to services. And so really it's about, making assumptions versus how can we take the data that is out there to better leverage real, timely consumer behavior and influence how brands can connect with consumers. And so we're also seeing an increased trend around how brands need to be transparent about how they're using data. At the same time, consumers being more apt to consent to giving that data if there's a real value that's given back to them at the end of the day and allows them to control things that they wouldn't have necessarily been able to in the past. So the first example is a startup founded by 2 MIT alumni, and it uses machine learning to create entirely personalized skin serums based on the user's skin characteristics or the characteristics that they put into the system. So it's a good example of a platform that collects a lot of data from its users, what they like about themselves, their habits, their medical history, their skin condition, things like that. But it provides a clear value exchange in relation to that. So it also communicates to them what they've done with this brand is they're letting people know how their data will be used. And in this case, it's to create skin products that are 100% adapted to their specific skin. So you're not only getting a product that wouldn't have normally been available without going directly to an esthetician or to a doctor prior, it's giving you that access, but also giving you control over it at the same time. Basecamp, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, as a project management platform from the United States. But basically, they've decided to push their transparency around data usage to a whole new other level in terms of how they're using it, to either gain or regain, depending on the consumer, their trust of the company. And so very clearly put forward a code of ethics around how they use the data and how it's being captured. And they've also decided to remove all third-party trackers on Basecamp to ensure that customers know that they aren't being tracked without them knowing. The notion being that just because you can track someone doesn't mean that you should. And then the last one was a little bit further outside of that case, but in terms of the do-it-yourself or empowering customers to take on things that they haven't done before. This is an example from Fromage d'ici. Sorry for my terrible French. But basically, it's a group of dairy producers in Quebec where they've started to bring in various celebrities to share out recipes that they can make in their home and call on customers to invite them to do the same thing, and ultimately inspire and encourage customers to do their own DIY that they wouldn't normally do at home and empower them to do so. So again, this idea of getting people to go out on their own, do things that they wouldn't normally, and ideally encourage creativity and sort of better results at the same time. So pretty exciting.
All right. This is it. We've already spoken for about 45 minutes, so thank you for spending your lunchtime with us again. We do have a few minutes for questions. Again, as Jessica mentioned earlier, if you go to the chat function, you can just type out your question there, and we'll do our best to answer it, and hopefully in a satisfactory fashion. So we'll
Good.
just
Thank you. Good. Thank you, Christian.
No,
and
yep.
I have a question. I think we have about we have time for 1 or 2 questions. So let's start with one. Home delivery, pickup in store, subscription services, and the likes all seem to be well. Do you think that this will last?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it depends on the specific industry. I think it depends on, you've seen a lot of challenges with some delivery companies not being able to make margins. On the flip side, though, the LCBO is a client of ours, and it's been really interesting seeing that as the legislation has opened up, that people are now able and willing to go direct to the makers as well. And so I think there's going to be a shift to those products and services that provide the subscription model is a really interesting one of make it easy for me to try things without having to go into the retail environment. So the subscription model is an interesting one. I think there are certain things that will just become normal in terms of just getting the products and services that we use regularly just replenished on a regular basis. But I do think there are ones that will return back to some sense of normalcy. I do think that still fashion is going to be more of a challenging one in terms of getting the feel, the touch, the fit. But I imagine there'll probably be a lot of supplementary businesses that will pop up to get your measurements more accurately and to sort of codify the measurement systems that companies are using. So I do think it'll continue, but I think the success of the delivery and in-store and omni-channel sort of pickup will depend on the specific industry.
Yeah, I agree. And there's an opportunity, I believe, with the subscription-based services in this context, because it's building on this whole sort of longer-term engagement with the customer that may have a deep impact moving into the future. Already before the crisis, it was actually making sort of an important imprint with millennials and Gen Z. But I believe now it will sort of reach older generations as well because of the outcome of the crisis. The other aspect that looking into this, where I see that there's a danger, and you don't want to be sort of sideswiped by this old direct-to-consumer trend that may emerge from this crisis. Already before the pandemic, Nike was heading to direct-to-consumer sales. We saw the example of Brathwaite watches that want to do it as well. And so there might be an opportunity out there for manufacturers to consider direct-to-consumer, which they would have not before the crisis. So, and this could have a deep impact also on what's our retail footprint out there in Canada and the US moving forward.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I'll just add from the creative agency side of things is I think there's tremendous opportunity that's been largely untapped around how those services are delivered. What are the supplemental materials or content that would accompany some of these things? So as opposed to, an Uber Eats driver just dropping something off at the curb in front of your house, how is it packaged? What comes along with it? Is there content there where you can learn from the chef how it was made, and how can you build those kinds of relationships? And some of that more tactile and differentiating material that you would get normally if you went into a restaurant or into a store. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to figure out how do you balance the efficiency of that delivery to make it profitable, but also how do you supplement it with ways that help your brand stand out and build affinity over time. So I think there's going to be a really interesting space to play in to sort of find that balance between creating something that feels special and feels unique, but also is still able to be replicated at scale.
Good. Thank you. We'll be having one last question, but don't worry, if you have any questions, you can. We will send all of the recordings so you can answer back and ask questions. So to start, you mentioned that Canadians are buying locally more during the pandemic. Do you know or suspect why? Is it to support the local economy, or is there a shift in changing habits towards and helping the environment?
Well,
go ahead, Christian.
Oh, well, from the data, and we can sort of look at it more broadly afterwards. From the data, we see that more people are buying as a reaction to the local economy being threatened. Every recession, we see the same thing. 2008, 2009, we saw a push towards buying local because we believe, or we want to be sort of a bit of a protectionist whenever we feel that there's a downturn in our economy. So the economy is the major driver, but then the secondary driver that was there before the pandemic that was actually pushing a lot of the change was this idea of reducing your carbon footprint altogether. So it's not because more of us are doing it from an economic perspective in the short term. It doesn't mean that that trend towards a more sustainable way of buying stuff is not still out there, is not still growing. So I think it's not one or the other. It's more one and the other at the present time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'll be really curious to see what data comes out in terms of the impact of delivery on the environment and what that looks like. But I do think that local is an interesting one because it kind of has many layers and levels. If you think about local, truly local, as in, within a 10-minute walk of your home, through to provincial. We saw with the example that we raised coming out of Quebec is that local in Quebec is very different from local in Ontario, I feel, for a number of different cultural reasons, and then made in Canada versus elsewhere. I think that's been more heightened just in terms of the political landscape that we've seen and our dependency on other countries and what that does in terms of, even if you just think about the challenges that we'll likely have in the coming months as products coming from China, as an example, will be reduced. And so what does that make us have to do as a country in terms of setting up our own sustainable system? But I do think it's fairly basic in terms of it's in your face when it comes to like the actual local neighborhoods. If you take a walk down Queen Street West as an example in Toronto, stores are boarded up. And so I think it's made it quite real that in order for these businesses to survive, they need an input or an influx of support. And so I think in the past where local has kind of been a bit ephemeral, I think this is now, it's a time where it's like, if you want these things to exist and if you want to protect some of the things that we value in our own neighborhoods, there's a clear way to do that by supporting them with by paying for their products and services. So I think it's just become a bit more real, and people are recognizing that those things that they used to take for granted will disappear if they're not supported.
Well, that's good. Thank you very much to both of you. If you have any question about the study, feel free to contact us, and we will also send the recording in a few hours. So thanks, Keith and Christian.
Pleasure. Thanks everyone for joining. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye-bye.